Carlos Doesn't Remember is an intriguing podcast about the story of a young boy and his struggle to get a good education. Gladwell's podcast portrays the story from the first person because Carlos is present and included in the podcast. Eric, the man in charge of the wonderful program called Yes, and Carlos' sister are also included in the podcast. Gladwell structures his podcast in such a way that the listeners can follow along and get the most from his story. To start off, I'll be talking about his choice of a topic. Is it true that America is good at capitalization? This is something that's actually going on. There are kids in lots of different places who don't have the same opportunities as other kids. And reality is that that's not really going to change. In theory, every kid has the opportunity to go to high school and every kid can get a scholarship to go to university. But in reality, in practice, it's not realistic because not everyone is told to go to school or is told that education is valued. Some people just do it because they can, because school's around and they drop out. It's very sad, but that's kind of the way it happens, and that's how it is for Carlos. Carlos's story is also portrayed in chronological order, which keeps you very interested in the story because you want to know what happens to him after all these horrible events that he really can't control. He just happened to get dealt a bad hand. It keeps you in suspense, and it also keeps things organized because if it wasn't in chronological order, you'd just be flying back and forth between all these different things that were happening to him and all these different opportunities that he managed to get because of Eric and Yes. Another part of the story is how Gladwell included other voices in his podcast. He had Carlos and Eric and Carlos' sister talking during it, which made it a lot more personal, having Carlos and his sister tell important parts of the story, like when Carlos was talking about his parents and how his dad was absent for most of his life and how his mom's in prison now, or how before she went to prison they got taken away from her and got put in the foster care system. If Gladwell had just told that, it wouldn't have seemed as real as whenever you heard it firsthand from Carlos. The music that Gladwell chooses to play during the podcast whenever no one's talking, and it gives you a chance to think about what you just heard, but also whenever Gladwell is just telling the introduction to a story or the introduction to the questions, the reasoning for why he's asking the questions. It kind of makes the scene that whenever Carlos talks seem a lot more important. It makes you really interested in what he's going to say. The one thing I had a problem with for the podcast was Gladwell's perspective, because Gladwell is a Canadian. He's from a town near Guelph where it's very safe, and he didn't go through the same things as Carlos, and he never will. He went to university in Toronto, and he lived where there were no gangs, and everyone went to school, and everyone was white. And I think it's very difficult to go somewhere and tell them how to fix what they're doing when he really has never been in the situation that they are. In conclusion, Carlos Doesn't Remember is a very sad podcast with a topic that people need to know about. Gladwell was brave enough to talk about it, even though maybe he doesn't exactly know what it's like to be them. He at least sees that there's a problem happening. He just doesn't necessarily know how to fix it right away. And having Carlos with the personal events as well as the facts made you really realize what they went through and believe how horrible it really was. I think Gladwell's podcast is a success, and the structure he used to do it made it even better.